At least one of the world's major central banks isn't conflicted about consumer prices. The Swiss made a bold move earlier today, though for reasons hardly anyone is going to like. They said we aren't the least bit concerned about inflation. Instead, it's what's happening around the rest of the world that has forced them to act. Now, earlier we'd expected them to sell francs to do something about the escalating situation in the currency. Maybe thinking about a rate cut later on this year, but they went for the rate cut right out of the gate. Compare the Swiss National Bank and what they're doing to the Federal Reserve, and yesterday it's absolutely confused dot mess. The Swiss have a message for the Fed, the ECB, and everyone else. We know you're going to be cutting rates and maybe be cutting them by a lot. They keep coming back to the same theme over and over and over again in all of these places. The dovishness, where is it coming from? Well, according to everyone, it comes from everyone else. And even the Swiss said the issue here is weakness abroad. It's weakness in the global economy. It's weakness that we don't want to say it's here in our backyard, but it could show up in our backyard because everyone else is struggling. So the Swiss National Bank unexpectedly cut its interest rates, its benchmark cash rate, and they did so for globally synchronized reasons. They're getting ahead of a wave of central bank rate cuts they're basically telling you are about to happen. As we move along in exploring what the Swiss are seeing from their unique perspective, I do want to mention next week Eurodollar University is having our spring sale. We've got deals on memberships as well as our subscriptions. That's the daily briefing and the daily deep dive analysis. Good prices and bundles everywhere. All of the information will be available at our website, eurodollar.university. And of course, I'll make sure to tell you about it here on YouTube. But that's just to let you know, coming up, spring sale at Eurodollar University. It begins with the Swiss saying, we are not the least bit concerned about inflation, consumer prices, or anything else. As the SNB statement said, the easing of monetary policy has been made possible because the fight against inflation over the past 2.5 years has been effective. Yeah, they're saying central banks did it because, of course, they're going to say that. For some months now, inflation has been back below 2% in Switzerland, and thus in the range the SNB equates with price stability. According to the new forecast, inflation is also likely to remain in this range over the next few years. So no confliction about our prices re-accelerating, will oil restart expectations and all that other nonsense. The Swiss are saying inflation has come in less than we've expected, and we see all the ingredients that are going to keep it there over the intermediate and maybe even longer term. You look at the trend in the CPI in Switzerland. It never really got all that high to begin with because the Swiss are a more stable economy, but 3.4% by the third quarter of 2022 was the peak. And again, we keep coming back to that. 2022, before rate hikes really got started, we were already seeing consumer prices turn around because it's not about rate hikes and it was never really inflation. It was the downside of the supply shock. So throughout 2023, like a lot of places around the rest of the world, consumer prices in Switzerland decelerated down to around 1.6%, which at least in Switzerland was below their target rate. It had kind of stabilized toward the end of last year, which caused a little bit of hand-wringing, the usual, okay, what's going on here? But as far as what's supposed to happen in the first quarter of 2024, they're thinking consumer prices actually fell further when last year at the end of the year, they thought maybe the CPI would accelerate up to around 2% this year, maybe calm down toward the end of the year, then stay below target in 2025. But as of their current estimates, which see the CPI down around 1.2% in the first quarter, they're only thinking at best it rebounds to 1.5% by the third quarter this year before then falling down to closer to 1% in 2025 and beyond. So much weaker than anticipated consumer prices, regardless of other external factors, including commodity input costs and things like that. Food, energy, all the usual suspects. So as far as the Swiss National Bank concerns, they start out saying, we don't see any of the global impacts that are going to restart local consumer price pressures here in Switzerland. That then allows them to turn their attention to these other factors. And while the Swiss economy as a whole has held up relatively well compared to certainly its close neighbors across Europe, There are other issues which the Swiss National Bank, given its institutional makeup, is bound to focus on, starting with the franc. The Swiss franc last year had appreciated pretty sharply, which the Swiss don't really like. They want the currency to be largely stable. In fact, they have focused on the currency instability for a very long time, longer than most central banks have been in existence. So for the Swiss, they would love to focus on the currency, which means that they have to pay attention, or at least they believe they have to pay attention to interest rate differentials. Here's what the SNB statement said. With its decision, the SNB is taking into account the reduced inflationary pressure as well as the appreciation of the Swiss franc in real terms over the past year. But essentially what they're saying is, we don't want the franc to strengthen any more than it had last year. And so what we're afraid of here is, now that we don't have to pay attention to consumer prices locally, what we're afraid of is that the franc is going to appreciate dramatically, because we know that central banks around the world are going to be cutting rates. What they're saying, in essence, is that they know central banks are going to be cutting rates through the rest of this year, starting with their big neighbor next door, the European Central Bank. And if the European Central Bank begins cutting rates, and maybe aggressively, that could potentially put upward pressure on the Swiss franc, which the Swiss don't want. And again, now that they're free from having to focus on consumer prices, what the Swiss are saying is, we're going to focus on making sure the franc doesn't get too much stronger. It was already strong last year, and we don't want it to go any higher. So if we believe that interest rates and policy differentials are one of the drivers for a strong franc, we're going to get out in front of this thing. We're going to cut rates here before anyone else has a chance, because they're still talking about inflation risks around the rest of the world, and we know that's not an issue. So we know that weakness in Europe and weakness in other places, including the United States, is going to drive policy rates lower in all of these other places. So even though the Swiss don't necessarily have that same economic weakness in their forecast, what they're saying is, because we're focused on the franc and we know everyone else is weak, they're going to be cutting rates. So we're going to get ahead of them by cutting rates today. And what they're basically confirming is the globally synchronized downturn story. No more consumer prices, everybody into the other side of the boat, rate cuts, because we're going to be talking about excess weakness for the remainder of this year. They're putting their rates where their mouth is. And again, they even said in the statement, our forecast for Switzerland, as for the global economy, is subject to significant uncertainty, except in this case, not in terms of consumer price. The main risk is weaker economic activity abroad. That's what we keep hearing around the rest of the world too. The Japanese have said the same thing, even though they're hiking rates there for politics. They said, hey, we're worried about the recession that's already in Japan. Maybe the overseas weakness interrupts the virtuous cycle from Japanese wages before it really gets a chance to get going, which is what the evidence continues to show. The Swiss are simply acting on the same impulse that is being talked about, discussed, the same feeling that has run through central banks all the world over, including in the Federal Reserve. Implicit in the Fed's almost like guaranteed certainty they're going to cut rates, but I mean, it's close as it possibly can get. And implicit in that is the Fed worried that maybe the U.S. economy doesn't hold up. That weakness in the labor market might be, as Jay Powell said, non-linear. It seems fine, and then all of a sudden it's not fine. And here are the Swiss saying, yeah, the chances of the not fine are already substantial to begin with. And we're saying that we realize that the rest of you central bankers are going to realize the same thing relatively quickly. So the Swiss went first because their franc focus forced them to do so. And without being conflicted about consumer prices, they have nothing holding interest rates up. And they're saying that nothing is going to be holding interest rates up for everyone else as well. One of the main avenues for this weakness abroad, that's abroad from everywhere apparently, is of course the global trade recession. It's something that all the central banks continue to talk about. Problems where if the global trade recession deepens, that's going to have a negative impact on the local economy. Even though central bankers like to say, our local economy is okay, but everyone else is weak, and so that weakness can come here. It's like a built-in convenient excuse, except in this case, it's actually true, except The difference being that the weakness abroad is everyone altogether. It's globally synchronized, not one place or another. It's basically everything. That's what the Swiss are actually saying. We got some data recently that suggests the global trade recession and demand abroad has indeed softened yet again. After seemingly stabilizing toward the end of last year, seemed like maybe the trade recession was going to turn a bit of a corner, another bout of disinflation, plus some higher sentiment, as we've seen in some places, over the prospect of rate cuts that are increasing, then maybe that would be enough to have the global economy turn a corner. The Chinese, of course, doing all of their massive stimulus, which, according to many people, absolutely is going to help the Chinese situation. So there was some thought at the end of last year the global trade situation had calmed down and maybe even stabilized enough to start a small turn toward recovery. Well, Taiwan, which is a key export economy, you've got Japan, you've got Germany, you've got resource economies like Brazil, but Taiwan, a key export economy where it comes to, as we all know, electronic components. So they're a bellwether for global demand, exactly the thing the Swiss National Bank and everyone else is talking about. And Taiwan just reported their export orders figures for the month of February. And in January, they had been up by about 2% year over year in US dollar terms, which suggested, again, maybe the trade recession is softening and the global economy is heading toward the right direction again. But February, minus 10.5% year over year. That's well below expectations, which were plus 1.3%. Most analysts were expecting export orders for Taiwanese goods to continue to rise in February, even though there's some Lunar New Year holiday stuff involved in that too, some calendar skews. It doesn't matter, 10%, 10.5% is a substantial decline in export orders, meaning forward-looking here. When you look at it by category, you see Taiwan is benefiting already to an extent from the AI boom. That's one reason why their export orders appeared to stabilize and one reason why analysts were expecting them to continue to increase in February. And in the category of electronics, though, in US dollar terms, the export orders were down 4.3% in February. But when you combine January and February together, they were up 6.3%, which again, there's the calendar skew. And it is consistent with the idea of the AI bubble and Taiwan benefiting from all of that. So it wasn't electronics where the weakness showed up. Textiles were down big in February, January and February together, about 6% there. Basic metals, that was kind of positive January and February. But really, electrical machinery down 6.7% January and February combined. And the big one, information and communications products. Down 11% in February, but 16% January and February. So a huge decline in information and communication products, which is consumer goods, things like that. Weak consumer demand to start 2024. And again, these are export orders, meaning looking ahead. And where is that weakness in consumer electronics coming from? Well, it's not the rest of Asia, at least not as far as Taiwan's concerned. The rest of the Asian economies, at least those in its local area, export orders increased by 28% in February and 70% in January, February combined. So a bit of an uptick in consumer demand for Taiwanese electronic goods and other types of goods from the rest of Asia, sort of defying what we talked about with Japan and the pattern of consumer spending around, at least the Japanese said, North Asia. China, Hong Kong, export orders from Taiwan down 6% in February, but they're up 11% in January, February combined. But then there's the New Year's comparison as well as the base effect made by comparing to 2023. But the real weakness from Taiwan, remember, this is consumer demand, largely driven by consumer demand. Export orders to the United States down 5.8% in February, down 1.3% January, February combined. So some softening in U.S. demand, which is consistent with the consumer spending numbers, retail sales that we talked about recently. So maybe some softening in the United States, warning to Jay Powell, rate cuts there. Japan, despite the fact the Japanese went ahead and hiked rates, according to Taiwan, export orders were down 28% in February and down a quarter in January and February combined. So weakness in Japanese consumers, which consistent with the actual data rather than what the Japanese are saying about how the virtuous cycle is going to take hold. But the big one here, the real major decline in terms of Taiwanese export orders, is Europe. Minus 35.6% in February alone, minus 44.2% January and February combined, which you'll notice is Europe, Switzerland's backyard. Switzerland thinking about, acting in front of the ECB that is going to have to cut rates because the European economy is, out of everywhere, the biggest mess in the world. And the Europeans know it. In fact, that's why Christine Lagarde has basically laid the groundwork for rate cuts to happen in Europe, probably sooner than later. Again, the Swiss know that. That's why they're acting today. Even in the last statement, the ECB said, the economy remains weak. Consumers continue to hold back on their spending, investment moderated, and companies exported less, reflecting a slowdown in external demand and some losses in competitiveness. They're talking about the currency, but again, weakness abroad. And the ECB even finished up by saying the risks to economic growth remain tilted to the downside. Growth could be lower if the effects of monetary policy turn out to be stronger than expected. They always got to say that. But a weaker world economy or a further slowdown in global trade would also weigh on euro area growth and global growth as a whole. So exactly what the Swiss are saying, which is what the ECB is already saying and what the Taiwan's export sector is already experiencing. Another potential serious downturn in weakness abroad. Therefore, it's going to lead to a cascade of consequences that end up with central banks around the world cutting rates. The Swiss know it. They just got ahead of it. So the S&P surprise rate cut for today. Number one, it's based on the fact that they don't see any inflation pressure in Switzerland, and they're not expecting to find any from the outside coming in. But also implicit in their action is, of course, they don't see the same thing happening, a reignition of inflation around the rest of the world, because number two, they're focused on the franc. And because they're focused on the franc and they don't want it to appreciate, what they're basically saying is we know everyone else is going to cut, and that could put upward pressure on the franc. And therefore, because everyone else is going to cut, we're going to cut first to make sure there isn't an interest rate differential that pushes the franc upward. But again, implicit in that policy is the fact that other central banks are going to be cutting, and other central banks are going to be cutting, number one, because like the Swiss National Bank, they're going to find that inflation is not a risk, and number two, more importantly, that they're going to be more concerned about economic weakness. Not just from abroad, but also in each one of their local jurisdictions. And that includes the Federal Reserve. The rate cuts are coming, and the Swiss National Bank basically fired their starter pistol for the global trend. Contrast the Swiss National Bank with the Federal Reserve. The Swiss is unconflicted. The Federal Reserve is highly conflicted. It's dots dancing all over the place. I just went over them in a recent video. That's the one linked below. As always, I thank you very much for joining me. Huge thank you. Eurodollar University members and subscribers, check out our spring sale. And until next time, take care.